Hello again. This is Andy Vining, reading My Mother's Diaries. Welcome back to episode 9, March 1949. March arrived in a rather unsettled mood, as though the winter itself had not quite decided to leave. Snow, cold rain, and bitter winds swept across the fields around Hiltonbury Farmhouse, and for the first week or so it felt more like February refusing to move on. Yet beneath the cold earth there were signs of change beginning quietly. Seeds and fertilizer waiting to be drilled, hens becoming broody, and the longer evenings that always seemed to bring people together for dancing at the village hall. Life at the farmhouse carried on with its usual rhythm, a mixture of farm work, family life, sewing, neighbours calling in, and small daily jobs that seemed never quite to end. Joan Beaton, my friend, was often in and out of the house helping with the eggs, washing, and other jobs, and one evening she called round before I went off dancing at the hall to babysit for me while I was out. The hall dancing lessons had become a regular feature of village life, and even when the weather was cold and miserable, it always seemed worth the effort as everyone seemed to enjoy my lessons. Frank White stopped by one evening, sniffling with a bad cold. I hope we don't all get it. And I spent a lot of time sitting with a darning basket, repairing socks and stockings, while the wireless played quietly in the background. We, of course, not got any electricity yet, but plans are afoot for the supply to be laid on, but there is such a big shortage of equipment, I don't know when it will happen. Visits to the family filled many of the days, and I went round to see Marjorie, who had been unwell with pleurisy, but now she seemed to be improving. It was a relief to find her already up and about. From there I called in at Beechcroft to see Mother, before returning home to the usual business of cooking, cleaning, and looking after the children. The early part of the month brought a small worry when Andrew came home from school feeling poorly, and he had to stay in bed for a few days. Children's illnesses always seem to arrive at an inconvenient moment. While keeping an eye on him, I still managed to dig out the front flower bed in the garden, taking advantage of a break in the weather, though the wind still remained very, very cold. Indoors, my sewing basket was never far away. I'd begun making new pinafore skirts for the girls from a length of check gingham. There were several to make, so the cutting out and stitching filled many evenings. The weather then turned truly dreadful. Cold rain sweeping across the fields and soaking everything. John went off to the Winchester Bar End Farm Sale, one of the auctions where farmers gather to see what livestock or equipment might be worth bringing home. He didn't bring any this time. That evening, Mother and Bella came to babysit, so we escaped the cold for a trip to the pictures with Joan and Les. John joined us too. The film was called Cass Timberlane, and though none of us claimed it was particularly wonderful, it made for a pleasant enough evening out. Later reports said that it was an awful film, but it had a good cast starring Spencer Tracy, Lana Turner, and Zachary Scott. Winter had one more surprise for us. One morning we woke to find the countryside covered in snow again. Quite a heavy fall, it lay across the fields and hedgerows like a thick blanket. John still managed to go out to football, though, determined as always to watch the Saints play. And while the rest of the day was filled with callers, Nora and the family stopped by, and I spent time mending shirts and continuing with the girls' pinafore frocks. Mother called round as well, but she was not feeling particularly well today. I don't know what the problem is. In the evening, we gathered around the wireless and listened to a radio play, which turned out to be really gloomy and morbid. Hardly the thing one wanted on such a cold night, but at least the log fires were a great source of heat, though it's still very cold in the bedrooms. Sunday brought the unpleasant sight of snow turning into slush everywhere. The roads and paths were a dreadful mess. It seemed far wiser to keep the children at home rather than attempt Sunday school in such conditions. But by afternoon the house was filled with restless children, which very nearly drove us all mad. Fortunately, the evening provided some relief. We went to the Parkers, where there was old-time dancing. There was plenty of laughter and good music, and by the time we walked home, everyone felt far better. Farm life continued quietly alongside all this social activity. The weather remained poor for several days, but washing still had to be done and dried whatever the opportunity arose. John attended meetings in Eastleigh and Winchester, and neighbours continued to call by the farmhouse looking to buy poultry or eggs. One evening I took a carpet over to Mother's so she could give it a proper clean for me with her vacuum cleaner, and Joan babysat looking after Heather and Andrew while I went dancing at St Boniface Hall again at this time. After the dance, several of us decided to go to the pictures. Joan, Mrs P, Jack and myself, and afterwards we gathered at Sylvia's house for a late cup of tea and a good chat before finally making our way home. Andrew had stayed home again with swollen glands, looking and feeling rather miserable. But I managed to slip out to have my hair done, as Mrs Fulbrook was there to see Andrew was okay. It felt like a small luxury in the middle of such busy days. Village life was rarely dull. The Young Farmers Club held a dance at Caddenham, which proved a very lively evening for us. I went to visit Marjorie again and was pleased to see her so much improved. And then John and Norman spent the day at another farm sale in Southampton to see if there was anything of interest to buy for the farm. Later, I took flowers to the cemetery, a quiet moment of remembrance, because the middle of the month marked the anniversary of Father's death. Mother and Bella came as well, and then came to tea afterwards, and there was a thoughtful feeling about the day remembering Dad. Even so, life did not stop. Joan came over that evening and we had a rabbit for supper, bringing Leslie's brother along with her. Nora and the family also dropped in during the day, so the house remained lively despite the sad memories. It was good news shortly afterwards when the government finally ended clothes rationing. After years of wartime restrictions, it felt almost strange to think that one might buy clothes without counting coupons. John began drilling the corn in one of the Ramalli fields, an early step in the farming season, but the weather once again interfered and rain soon forced him to stop work. Trips into Eastleigh followed. We bought John a waistcoat to wear with his new white trousers, and on another outing I found myself a new jacket, and we did not have to use coupons. Such a great relief. At last there came a beautiful spring day, the sort that makes one believe winter really might be ending. The sun shone and the air felt fresher rather than bitter. I even managed a little gardening before going out dancing again that evening. Frank came by that day to help John with some work on the farm and stayed to supper afterwards. Domestic tasks filled the following days, finishing the endless darning, altering Heather's curtains, and preparing tea for visitors who arrived regularly at the farmhouse door. Mother, Bella, Jean and Lorna came one afternoon and I made a load of sandwiches which disappeared very quickly. Then came one of the most exciting farm moments of the month. A crate arrived containing 150 newly hatched chicks, little Rhode Island Reds crossed with brown leghorns. The arrival of new chicks always brought great activity to the farmyard. They chirped loudly from the box and needed carefully settling into their new surroundings under their heaters. Joan and Les came over that evening and we shared supper together, talking about the chicks and the farm. The following evening proved rather hectic when we went to the Parkers again for more dancing. And a few days later, John and I attended the police ball in Winchester. It was quite an event and we didn't arrive home until 3:30 in the morning, far later than usual for farm life. And we never learn that it is so difficult when we have to get up so early for milking the same morning. The days continued with a usual mixture of farm work, cleaning, sewing and social visits. At one point, Lassie came into season, which added to the general farmyard commotion, as we certainly didn't want her mating with some itinerant dog passing by. Mrs. Fulbrook was a great help with spring cleaning in Janet's bedroom, while Joan once again kept an eye on Heather for me. I walked over to Beechcroft one afternoon and stopped at Joan's for a cup of tea on the way back. The weather slowly improved. One bright but windy day, I managed to work in the front garden before returning indoors to continue sewing the girls' pinafore skirts. Joan and I walked around the fields with the dogs on another afternoon, enjoying the fresh air and the small signs of spring appearing among the hedgerows. Mother came to stay that night towards the end of the month, and then came a particularly lovely day, the 26th of March. It was my birthday. The weather was warm and bright, quite a change from the snow and rain that had begun the month. Mother returned home in the morning, but came back again for lunch, and John went off to football, as he always did on Saturdays when Saints were playing at home. Visitors seemed to arrive one after another throughout the day to wish me a happy birthday. And that evening, Joan and Les took me and John out to Greenaway to celebrate my birthday. It was a very pleasant outing and a lovely way to mark the occasion. Soon afterwards, I discovered something delightful back at home. A bantam hen had quietly hatched several chicks on her own. Finding them tucked away together in the stable felt like another sure sign that spring was finally taking hold. The last day of the month returned to ordinary routines. Washing and iron were filled one day, another evening was spent sewing pinafore frocks yet again. One dance had to be cancelled because the key had jammed in the Boniface Hall door, so Joan and I simply walked home together and had a cup of tea instead. Mother was still not feeling particularly well on one visit and complained that her heart was troubling her. That was a bit of a worry for us. We'll have to watch that one. Towards the very end of the month, I went shopping in Southampton with Joan, and we met John and the children in town and bought them all new Clark's sandals at French's shoe shop. When I decided to add up the cost of the children's clothes, I realised they'd come to nearly £1. That was quite a considerable sum. That would be £32 today. Back at the farmhouse, another bantam chick had hatched, bringing the little group to 4. And U.V. Hatley from the sawmills bought the other bantams that he wanted to breed from us. And so March came to its end. A month that began with snow and slush had slowly softened into the first signs of spring. Chicks in the farmyard, seeds beginning to grow into the ground, and longer evenings filled with dancing, laughter, and the steady rhythm of everyday life on the farm. Spring finally begins to take hold at the farmhouse. One quiet evening, as the light fades over the fields, the first nightingales of the year begin to sing. And so we move into April 1949. And by the time April arrived, the long winter that had lingered through March was finally beginning to loosen its grip on the countryside. Clocks turned forward on 3rd of April, and the children suddenly find themselves going to bed in daylight, which was a great pleasure. John began planting peas in the front field and potatoes over Flexford under Nightwood, and the manure carts rumbled slowly across the fields, preparing the soil for the new season. In the garden, the first lawns are cut and gladioli are planted. And in the farmyard, there are chicks everywhere, and even a wild duck hatching her eggs. There are pony club meetings, football matches, elections in the village, and an evening when the kitchen table erupts into laughter over a ridiculous game of low football. The farmhouse was as busy as ever. Indoors, the sewing basket that had occupied so many winter evenings finally reached a satisfying end. The last of the girls' pinafore frocks was finished and neatly folded and ready to be worn. There was always something else waiting to be done, of course. One day, John and I went shopping together, calling on Marjorie and Malcolm along the way. And at Beechcroft, Fred had arrived to spend a weekend with Mother. So there was always a cheerful gathering there. Back at the farmyard, another small milestone had taken place. Lassie had finally been mated with Laddie, the Thompson dog on Basley Road. He was Lassie's chosen husband, which meant we might soon expect a litter of puppies. The following day, Bet and Fred came up to the house. Before long, the kitchen table was surrounded by family. Mother, Bella, Bet, Fred, all the children, all staying for supper. These simple gatherings always seemed to bring warmth to the house, especially after the long winter months. Village life continued as it always did, something bringing unexpected little dramas. One morning, old Mr. Cross came in with a badly scalded hand. We did what we could for him with bicarbonate and bandages before sending him on his way again. The weather was still unsettled, though. Some days brought terrible gales that shook the house and bent the trees. Even so, farm work carried on. John spent windy days with the men carting loads of dung across the fields. And inside the house I was busy with something rather more cheerful, making Andrew's birthday cake. Because on the 6th of April, Andrew's birthday arrived, and we celebrated it quietly. Andrew was a little better now, but Mother and Bella were not feeling well enough to come over. But Joan called in during the day and wished him a happy birthday. Later that evening, we took the children to the cinema to see Green Green Grass of Wyoming, which they enjoyed enormously. And Uncle kindly minded Heather while we were out, and Norman and John brought us home afterwards. Not long after that, the children broke up for the Easter holidays, and the whole house seemed suddenly much noisier. With the weather improving, they spent most of the time outdoors, running freely around the garden and the fields. I even managed to slip away to have my hair done again, leaving Heather at Beechcroft this time. Visitors continued to arrive regularly, neighbours dropping by with bits of news or simply for a chat. There was also an election that week, so I cycled up to the polling station to cast my vote, and later we heard the result. Mr. Toole, the Conservative candidate, won by a comfortable majority of 500. With the weather better, I was finally able to start working properly in the garden now. The front lawn was cut for the first time that year, and the fresh smell of grass drifting across the garden, it always felt like a true beginning of the outdoor season. One Sunday I spent the afternoon baking cakes cooling on the kitchen table while football practice carried on in the nearby field, in the hockey field. Another bright morning I cycled to Anfield with Jennifer and Julie Dean for a pony club meeting. The ride there in the clear spring air was almost as enjoyable as the meeting itself. Later that evening there was a football match with all the local lads, followed by supper at the Wide Awake Cafe up near Frian Hill. A lively evening that ended with plenty of laughter. The poultry yard was becoming noisier every day as more chicks appeared. I went round to Joan's house one afternoon to see the chicks she had hatched, and we stayed chatting over a cup of tea while admiring the little chicks. Meanwhile, John was busy across the field, still muck carting and spreading manure, preparing the ground for the crops that would soon be planted, and the ploughing was starting. Back in the garden, I continued working the soil, pulling weeds and turning the beds while the weather held fair. At last, one evening, I realised that the great pile of mending had finally been conquered. Every sock and stocking had been darned, and the basket was empty, a very rare achievement. But there were still plenty of outings and social moments going on. One day, Uncle George took the children and me to the local meet, and that was a lively affair. I even allowed myself 2 gin and oranges while we watched. I got a little bit tiddly. Jennifer went off to the circus with Julie Dean that same day and returned full of excitement, having had a lovely time. Perhaps the loveliest moment came later that evening. As darkness fell over the hedgerows and the fields, we heard the first nightingales of the year singing somewhere beyond the farm, and there was a sound that always seemed to mark the true arrival of spring. Church services continued as usual, sometimes held in the church hall, and on one beautiful morning we had coffee in the Beaton's garden afterwards, sitting outside in the sunshine. Mother and Bella came to tea that afternoon, and later we returned to the Beatons again for supper. One evening, the house filled with people, when a whole crowd came round for supper. Uncle Fred and Vi called in as well, and long before somebody suggested a game of blow football at the kitchen table. The game was ridiculous, played by blowing a tiny ball across the surface of the big kitchen table, but it caused so much laughter that we could hardly continue eating. Farm work continued steadily. John planted another plot of peas and began putting more potatoes in the ground over at Flexford. The garden kept growing too. I mowed the lawn again, and as it sprang up with fresh life, and planted rows of gladioli that promised bright colour later in the summer. One day, a wild duck hatched her eggs nearby, another small sign of the season turning. Trips to the village were frequent. I cycled up to buy a present for Nora's birthday, and the girls came along pushing Heather in the pram. Visitors continued to come and go all the time. Marjorie and Malcolm West called one afternoon, followed by Nora and her family again. Cross arrived one day bringing a box of young chicks with him to go with our others. Mother went away for a short visit to Betty and Fred, along with the Baisley girls. Evenings were often spent with neighbours, sometimes at the Parkers, sometimes at the Beatons, always filled with conversation and laughter. They are all such good friends and good company. The ordinary work of the house continued alongside everything else. Washing and ironing filled many mornings. Letters were written, mending reappeared almost as soon as it had been finished. One hen was carefully set on eggs, and everyone waited to see if she would hatch them successfully. Trips to the cinema remained a favourite treat. One evening I went with Lorna to see Johnny Ray in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which we both enjoyed very much. Towards the end of the month, the house filled again with Lily and Wally came from London. Auntie Bella and the boys all came to tea, Michael and Robert. On one other dull, rainy afternoon, I took flowers to the cemetery and stopped to see Joan for a while. More gladioli were planted in the garden, and Joan and Les came round that evening as well. Children continued moving between houses as they always did in village life. Jennifer took Heather to play at the Dean's, and young Michael Adkins came to our house on another day. Neighbours brought news with them wherever they went. One boy just had his tonsils removed, which seemed to be happening to half the children of the district this year. Then, at the end of the month, we decided on a small outing and took the children to the Dell to watch a football match between Romsey and Andover. Andover won the match, so I must admit I quite enjoyed the afternoon regardless. By the time April came to its close, the lawn had been cut, the garden planted, the fields being prepared, and the poultry yard was full of new life. Spring had settled firmly across the farm. And so April slipped quietly into memory. A month of growing gardens, new planted fields, children running free in the sunshine, and the soft song of nightingales drifting across the hedgerows, reminding us that spring had truly come at last. Thank you for listening to My Mother's Diaries, and next week we will be into May and June 1949.